Hi, class. Welcome back to another week of the lectures. I think this is week 4 that you are currently in. And that said, you have probably just finished with your first examination. So, congratulations. I know for the first few weeks we had a jam-packed schedule. So, it's great that you had gotten the first test over with, and I hope it was a fairly successful experience for you. And if not, please do reach out. Do contact me with questions, with comments, with concerns. If you think that something went wrong, or if you think that you are not able to catch up with all of the materials. So definitely do reach out. Now, when we met last week, the predominant topic of our inquiry was the Roman Empire, first as a republic, then for the Rome itself, first as a republic, and then as an empire. And for this week, and potentially for the portions of the following week, we are actually going to be continuing with the discussions of the Roman Empire. However, we will not so much focus on the actions of Romans themselves, but rather how all of these territories that are still parts of the Roman Empire, how they are going to be constructed. And particularly this week, we are going to be focusing on the eastern portions of the Roman Empire, because we're going to be talking about Rome or Roman Empire in the context of Christianity. And last week, during the second lecture, we have said that one of the Augustus's greatest legacies was this period that he established called the Pax Romana, this period of relative peace and stability. And this environment of peace and stability was a reality. It was true for the most part. However, that doesn't mean that there weren't some exceptions to this peace and things that were at all, it doesn't mean that things were at all times undisturbed in the Roman Empire. And there will be numerous local or provincial revolts, one of which was the so-called the Jewish Revolt or the Jewish War or the Jewish Rebellion. All of these terms are kind of used interchangeably. And this will definitely be one of the topics we will study today. Yet before we get to the topic of the Jewish revolt, before we get to the topic of how Christianity will eventually branch out of Judaism, we need to spend some time briefly covering the origins of the Jewish religion, because we cannot understand Christianity and the roots of Christianity without understanding the roots and origins of Judaism, okay? And the people who will kind of be the constructors of Judaism were the people known as the Hebrews. And the people who call themselves Hebrews will be the nomadic pastoralists who will probably migrate to the delta of the river Nile. And they will come there from the eastern territories. And they will come there approximately sometime between 14th and 13th century BCE, kind of seeking to expand their territory, seeking to actually migrate and hoping to find better lands for their herds of sheep and goats. And we know this because they will record it in the story. They will record this story in the book called the Torah. And Torah is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, containing the most important pieces of information that we have about the Hebrew people. And the text will also become later known as the Old Testament, of the Christian Bible as well. But at the time being, the origins of the Old Testament are known as Torah. And most of what we know about Hebrews, of course, comes from Torah. And it's important to note here, speaking of the religious texts in general, It's important to note that the Old Testament and the New Testament, or the Bible itself, just like any ancient documents, must be used with a care as a historical source, because it's very hard to trace the absolute historic accuracy and the absolute objectivity when we are using religious texts to decipher the lives of the people of the ancient civilizations and the accuracy of these stories, right? However, they do reveal to us some pieces of information regarding their belief systems and also perhaps how their societies were organized. And according to the second book of Torah, also known as the Exodus, the book of Exodus, when Hebrews arrived to Egypt, they will be enslaved by the Egyptian pharaohs for years. And Hebrews will still, nevertheless, eventually be led out of Egypt under the charismatic leader known as Moses. And the biblical account of this event is very dramatic. And according to the Exodus, Moses will deliver this message to Pharaoh, who at the time, looking at the historical years, was probably Pharaoh named Ramses II. So Moses speaks to Ramses II and said to him that there will be series of plagues troubling the Egypt, meaning that the plague would kill particularly a specific group of people, the firstborn sons, which for these ancient patriarchal societies was perhaps the worst kind of punishment imaginable. And to protect the Hebrews in Egypt, Moses will then instruct the Hebrews to prepare a sacrificial meal consisting of lamb as well as the bread containing no yeast, the so-called the unleavened bread. And on top of that, the blood of the lamb was to be painted over the doors of the Hebrew families. In this event, so that way, when God sends the plague, to Egypt, as Moses proposes. That way, the God will know which households to spare, right? And this event will become known in the Hebrew history and then later in Hebrew tradition as the holiday or the event of the Passover. Now, the next day, the perhaps terrified Pharaoh will order that the Hebrews need to be expelled from Egypt, and Moses will then instead lead Hebrews out in search of what they thought to be the Jewish promised land. And they will settle in the area that is between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River and the Jordan River Valley. That's the Dead Sea. This is the Jordan River. And this area, this territory is known as the Canaan. Okay. And the Canaan will be seen for the Judas, for the Jewish people as this promised land. So that is to say that following this event, that's in the Bible titled as the Exodus, the Hebrews were leaving the Egyptian land that they occupied, and they will move into the territory known as Canaan, and the territory will also be later known as the Israel and the Kingdom of Judea. Now, in Judea, having moved from Egypt, the Hebrews will continue on with their life and kind of switch to the agriculture. And over time, they will also be starting to establish their political systems as well, particularly as monarchies. And the kingdom of Judea will first consist of 12 different main Hebrew tribes, or 12 different Hebrew agrupations of people. And then in the year approximately 1025 BCE, the king named Saul will establish a monarchy over these 12 tribes. He will kind of unify these 12 original tribes, centralizing the power in his hands and proclaiming himself as the single king of Hebrews. So Saul will be known as the first king of the Hebrews. But just like any other kingdom at the time, Hebrews often had land disputes with the neighboring peoples. Because remember, they were just coming to this land, and it's not safe to assume that there was nobody in this territory before the Hebrews came to what they thought is their promised land, right? And Hebrews will often have disputes with their neighbors, one of whom were the people that in the Bible are referred to as the Philistines. And the Philistines are the ancient civilization that lived in the western portions of what will become Kingdom of Judea, portions that today are portions of which are today referred to as the Palestine, and they will come there approximately in the 12th century BCE. And the two of the perhaps most prominent Hebrew kings, first King Saul and then later King David as well, will be both responsible for waging multiple wars against the Philistines in that area. And King David will be the one to push back Philistines further to the west from the Judea and to claim that territory solely for the Hebrews themselves. And this is how you will also see, if you look on the map, you will also see this territory named as the so-called Philistine states. And after successfully defeating the Philistines or pushing them westward closer to the Mediterranean Sea, King David, will give his new kingdom a new capital city, which will be the city of Jerusalem, which he will make it into a bigger, a fortified city. And he will also make it the religious center of the Hebrew states, the religious center of Judaism itself as well. As you can see, this conflict that started between the Hebrew states and the Philistines in the 11th century BCE still kind of resonates strongly to this day, because the ultimate and a permanent peace settlement and land settlement between Israel and Palestine is still not achieved. And the roots of this conflict run so deep and so way back in the history. But back in the ancient times, the political advantage that Hebrews had was minuscule, actually, when we are trying to compare the Hebrew states, the kingdom of Judea, to other powers that were dominating the history of Western civilizations at that point. And for that reason, Hebrew states were fairly small, and they will continue to exist, but only as parts of a larger and major power. And for that reason, throughout history, we know that the Hebrew state was at different times occupied by different powers, including Egypt, including later Assyrians, including Macedonian Empire, and including, lastly, also the Roman Empire as well. But if Hebrews were not strong politically and militarily, they will nevertheless stand out of the crowd in terms of their religion. And their religion will be that of monotheism, in that they will worship a single God since their origins. And this is going to be a belief system based on the worship of what in Torah is referred to as Yahweh, which is basically a Hebrew word for a God, or for the God, since it's the single God himself. And because of their monotheism, they will kind of again stand out in the crowd of all of these polytheistic religions practiced by all of their conquerors, which will come especially problematic when Hebrew states, the kingdom of Judea, will be conquered by the Romans. And to fast forward our story, to plug it back in with the events of the Roman Empire, we must mention that Romans will start to occupy the territory of Judea since the year 63 BCE. And Hebrew state will be occupied by a person named Pompey, whose name should sound familiar. If you remember, we spoke of him in the context of the Roman civil wars and the Romans' first triumvirate. And in the early years of the Roman occupation of Judea, Actually, Jewish and Roman people, the relations between them following the initial occupation were fairly similar. And Romans under Pompey and a few of the subsequent governors of the territory governing for the name of the Romans will tolerate Jewish tradition and were fairly lenient in allowing Hebrews to kind of practice their monotheistic religion freely. And in fact, when Pompey seized Judea, he was very careful not to interfere too much with the Jewish monotheistic religion, and he will allow Hebrews to have Jewish high priest as the main authority of the area. And on top of that, Jewish under the Roman occupation were also exempt from having to make sacrifices to all of the different Roman gods and goddesses. And all that Rome asked of the people of Judea was to sacrifice one bull and two lambs on the behalf of the emperor himself in order to ensure the emperor's good health. Emperor of Rome, of course, that is. So that was like the only requirement asked of the Hebrew people in Judea, now occupied by Rome. But eventually, tensions within the Jewish community will, of course, rise. And to make a very long story short, Romans were expecting people of Judea to start to pay higher taxes. And eventually, people of Judea will also be asked to worship multiple Roman gods and different cults present in Rome at the time, including the so-called cult of the emperor, Roma et Augustus. You might remember this when we spoke about the Octavian Augustus as the emperor. He will be the one to establish this cult of the emperor. And so we see as the years went on, as the decades went on, Romans were becoming less and less lenient in allowing religious freedoms to the people of the Hebrew state, to people who were practicing the Jewish religion. And so the story kind of gets interesting here because this story will also lead us to the origins of the Christian faith as well. Because some people in the Jewish community, some people among the Hebrew state, were deeply troubled by having to make any compromises with the Roman culture, having to accept, even forcefully having to worship the cult of the emperor, which they, of course, did not want to do, or having to cooperate with the Roman rule in Judea altogether. And they will be the group of people known as zealots. And the word zealot originally in its origins refers to a fraction of Hebrews who will be fairly militant in their actions, who will want to do anything, anything possible to overthrow the Roman government and to also get rid of any aspects of Roman culture in the territory of Judea and Israel, right? So many of these zealots, according to the Hebrew Bible, according to Torah, expected the arrival of Messiah. And the Messiah is this a person, an actual person, or this promised deliverer of the Jewish nation prophesied in the Hebrew Bible. And the Zealots claimed that the Messiah will be the descendant of the King David himself, the actual real historical person, and that this person will be their liberator, who again will destroy Romans and reestablish the new Jewish kingdom, or establish this kingdom of David that is going to be free from any influence of the Romans. So, regardless of the fact that some Roman emperors, some to more limited extent than others, will allow for the Jewish people to practice their monotheism, zealots in particular will insist that everybody who is non Jewish has no legitimate reason to occupy Judea and to run the Jewish government. This tension will eventually lead to the event called the Great Jewish Revolt, which occurred in the year 66 AD, which was a major rebellion of the Jewish people, major rebellion of the Zealots, who are again against any form of Roman occupation of Judea. And in this incident, Jewish rebels will be initially defeating the troops of the Roman Empire that were at the time stationed in Judea. However, the Roman emperor at the time, Emperor Vespasian, he will dispatch a larger Roman army to Judea to put down this very revolt. And in the process, Romans will engage in this process of cultural destruction. They will destroy much of the city of Jerusalem, including portions of the Jewish temple, and will also take thousands of Jewish people as military captives and also enslave them and kind of scattered them throughout the Roman Empire as a form of punishment, kind of taking them away from the place that they thought is their homeland. In this revolt, and Romans suppressing the Jewish revolt, will kind of serve as an example that even though Pax Romana, this supposed 200 years of peace, was formally still in full swing at this point, things were not looking good for the religious minorities in Rome at the time. And it's a good example of a way in which the Romans will try to maintain the clear control over their subjects, willing to kind of crush rebellions and back it up by military force if the people whom they ruled over are not negotiating with Romans. Now, it was in this context, in the context of the Great Jewish Revolt, and mixing of Roman religious beliefs with local Jewish traditions and teachings, that one preacher in particular will become popular. And his name, of course, was Jesus of Nazareth, also known as Jesus Christ. And Jesus is actually born, or was born, approximately 60 years before the Jewish revolt. So this event right here happened after Jesus was born. So Jesus will grow up in this environment that was based in tension between the Roman authorities and the people of Judea. And he will grow up in the region of Galilee, in the northern parts of Israel today. And in this area, again, at the time of Jesus's birth, there were already people who were Jewish zealots, including parents of Jesus Christ, who too will be zealots. And so he was raised Jewish, surrounded by people, including his parents, who were Jewish zealots, protesting what they thought is a Roman foreign occupation of Judea and Galilee, the region in which Jesus was born, was part of Judea as well. Now, seemingly random question I like to address at this time is the question over how Jesus Christ would have looked like. We have on a slide one of the earliest depictions of Jesus, called the Good Shepherd, from the 3rd century AD. Again, one of the earliest depictions of Jesus himself. But in terms of kind of looking at how Jesus might have looked like, we actually do not. The only thing we do know about Jesus, we don't know how exactly he looked like, of course, but what we do know is that he in no way, shape, or form stood out in his appearance from other men coming from the region of Galilee. And in fact, in 2001, There will be a forensic anthropologist from England who will create a model of a Galilean man for the BBC documentary, working from the basis of an actual skull that archaeologists found in the region of Galilee. And that interpretation is the image you are currently looking on the slide. Now, this archaeologist will not say, this is Jesus. This is exactly what Jesus's face looked like. However, it was kind of simply meant to prompt people to consider Jesus as being a person of its place and of its time. And because this is how a man from Galilee looks like, and because of the archaeological records and the Bible itself tell us that Jesus looked like a typical guy coming from this region, this is as close to an estimate of what Jesus's appearance must have been like. So he was kind of darker complected, with curly, coarse hair as being one of the main physical attributes of Jesus. And that said, Jesus couldn't have been a light skinned, blue eyed, light haired, flat haired, as many modern popular Western depictions of Jesus want us to believe. Now, next, we're going to actually examine Jesus as a historical figure. So, not as this figure you know from Sunday class, but Jesus, if you are Christian, if you happen to be Christian, but rather Jesus as a historical figure. So, what can we know? What can we decipher about Jesus from historical sources? And we know for a fact that Jesus was a Jewish prophet and a storyteller. And he was one among the many of the hundreds of preachers and prophets that were working in the region of Galilee as well as Judea. And many of his followers believed that he was also a miracle worker of sorts. And as you very likely already know from some of the Jesus' sermons coming to us from the Gospels, from the New Testament, he spoke of things like compassion, love, turning the other cheek, charity, loving your neighbor, helping the poor, helping the weak, right? Which actually kind of makes sense that he would be saying those things when he was saying it, because given that Jews at the time lived in a seemingly precarious environment, having been occupied by Romans, so it would make sense for someone to speak out and say, perhaps people should be leading with love and care instead. And all that we know about Jesus's teachings and his life comes from the collection of book known as the Gospels. Gospel referring to or being translated as the Good News, written by Matthew, or we have four Gospels by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And these will be the books that in Christian religion will become known as the quote unquote the New Testament. And these Gospels will be written by decades. The majority of them are written decades after Jesus of Nazareth actually passed away. And for that reason, kind of provide conflicting stories about who Jesus was, about his accomplishments, and about his legacy. However, the authors of the New Testament recorded Jesus's life by hearing various people talk about what Jesus said and what Jesus did. And various people, we have to note here, might have had different interpretations of his works and Jesus's legacy. What's certain, however, is that Jesus and his followers believed that he himself will be the Messiah, that he is this Savior, and hence the name Jesus Christos, which is basically a Greek word for Messiah. So that's how the Christos, the Christ himself, comes to be. And I told you that Jewish believed that the Messiah, this prophesied Savior, will establish the kingdom of God on earth. It's going to be an actual king who's going to be present here among the living people. So Messiah will establish a state, according to Jewish tradition, a kingdom in this world. However, the followers of Jesus believed something different. They claimed that, as a savior, Jesus' role is to establish a spiritual kingdom that is outside of this world, a kingdom in heaven of sorts, and not here on this earth. Okay? And how do we know this? Well, because Jesus reportedly said the following. He said, quote, "Do not lay up yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust consume and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up yourself treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust consumes and where thieves do not break and steal. For also where your treasure is, there will your heart also be," right? So those who wrote the gospel will interpret these words that Jesus, to kind of claim that Jesus actually wants people to live their lives in preparation for heaven, to prepare people's souls to be saved after they die and not in this life. So he will be the king, but not for the earthly kingdom. And this claim is important because this statement will eventually lead to a split between the Jewish and the Christian religions, right? With Christians embracing Jesus as the Savior who saves people after they die, and the Jewish who are kind of still considering, they're still waiting on the arrival of their Messiah who will establish the kingdom of David and claim that Jesus, the Jewish will claim that Jesus is not that person, okay, or was not that person since he no longer is alive. Now, other things we know about Jesus as a historical figure was that he was quite a popular prophet and a healer. And popular because, unlike other prophets at the time, and there were hundreds of the prophets like Jesus in Judea, he will not charge money for his services, but he will rather perform his works for free, which was one of the reasons why he will be so popular, aside from the fairly what seems to be a peaceful message he was trying to spread. So we know Jesus as this pacifist, loving creature, love thy neighbor, turn the other cheek. But we also know that there is a historical evidence of Jesus, perhaps, I don't want to say not be so friendly, but perhaps acting in a way that was quite unusual for a pacifist person. And he will also act as a political activist in that he will openly speak against the Roman occupation of Judea, just like any zealot would of his time, right? And an act of rebellion that Jesus will orchestrate occurred in the 30th century AD when Jesus arrives to Jerusalem, and he will there stage a protest at the courtyard of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, the so-called Court of the Gentiles. The Gentile is a word that the Jewish gave to anybody who is of a non-Jewish origin. Anyways, the court at the temple will also serve as a place for people to sold animals that the Jewish required in their religious rituals of sacrifices. And so Jesus will enter this court and stages a protest where, seemingly in the act of rage, he will start to overturn tables of money chargers and he will drive out the vendors who were selling the food at the court of the Gentiles and who were selling souvenirs at the court as well. And he will also release all the sheep and cattle intended to be sold for sacrifice. And he'll also release, he will kind of break the cages of the doves and pigeons. And Jesus will also, for that action, subsequently be arrested for his protest by the Roman authorities, and he will be put on trial, and he will also, by Roman authorities, eventually be crucified as well. And the question now becomes, well, what is the Jesus's crime in the eyes of Roman authorities? Why was Jesus crucified? Because in our eyes, this might seem like, oh, it was just an act of rebellion. Guy just got angry. He just turned some tables and just to protest. No biggie, right? However, it will be because of Romans. Romans will start to view Jesus as this subversive person, as this political subversive, who seemingly, in the eyes of the Romans, will start to threaten the Roman establishment, the Roman political authorities. And they, Romans, will understand Jesus's protest at the court as an attack on Rome itself. Because with this act, in the eyes of the Romans, Jesus advocates for Jewish independence from the Roman Empire. And they thought, that he was this rebellious, again, subversive person, kind of speaking against the Roman dominance of Judea, and Romans will want to subsequently murder him as they would any other subversive, any other religious person, any other religious minority. So this was like the rules of procedure if you were Roman occupied person, you were Roman occupied peoples. And the Roman official named Pontius Pilate will have the authority over much of the Judea at the time, and he will, for that reason, also be in charge of prosecuting Jesus. However, he knew very little about Jesus's teachings in particular. And like all Roman officials, his main and primary concern was to maintain peace and order in Roman occupied territory, which was a very difficult task in Judea at this point because we have more and more zealots getting angry, staging protests against Roman occupation of Judea, and things were kind of tense already, right? And they were also particularly tense. The zealots were particularly nervous and antsy about Romans being there because Jesus will trash the temple during the time of Passover, which is a highly emotional time in Jewish religion, marking again the Hebrew departure from Egypt under the leadership of Moses, as we said during the beginning of the lecture, right? So Pilate feared that more protests like this will be staged against Romans during the Passover. And for that reason, he needs to punish Jesus to kind of deter other Jewish people from rebelling against Romans in such a way in which Jesus had also rebelled, right? And on top of that, Pontius Pilate also disliked Jesus because he knew that the Jewish had fairly conflicting opinions over the figure of Jesus himself. And for about 3 years, that Jesus spent preaching and just walking around, traveling, talking to people in Judea and Galilee, he would attract large crowds of people, very excited crowds of people. And you will have some Jewish followers who were expecting Jesus, to organize an actual revolt against Romans, like a political takeover, a coup of sorts, and for himself and for the people of Judea established the kingdom of David, right? So even some of the Jews actually claimed, hey, maybe this guy actually is our king. Maybe he is our savior. And thought Jesus himself insisted that kingdom that he would establish is that on earth. Right? So you had this fraction of Jewish people who thought maybe Jesus is our Messiah when Jesus was still alive. And other Jewish people will be opposed to Jesus and his preaching and would fear him and claim that he is dangerous, and that it's actually dangerous that he would even begin to claim that he is the Messiah. So they would blame him for trying to challenge the Jewish status quo. So you had some of the Jewish conformists who feared that Jesus too is this subversive person. And so Pontius Pilate kind of understood these sentiments of Jewish people that they had for and against Jesus. And he understood that there is no uniform response of Jewish community about Jesus's role and the meaning of Jesus's preachings. And then as the time went on, Jesus became more and more a figure of controversy, and Romans saw him as a catalyst for violence. And eventually, Jesus was arrested as a potential troublemaker, and Pilate will order Jesus to be scourged and to put to death by crucifixion, which was actually a very common form of execution that Romans had practiced on enslaved people, on subversive, political, religious, or otherwise subversive, thieves, and generally other non Roman citizen troublemakers who were sentenced for crime of sedition. And sedition refers to speaking openly and against the government and acting against the government. In this case, in Jesus's case, he committed the crime of sedition because he trashed the temple, which Romans thought was the Roman property. And for that reason, they will also apply the same sentence. Romans will apply the same sentence to Jesus, and that is the death by crucifixion. So it was this act, the cruel death of Jesus, that will put things in motion for the eventual formation of Christian faith. Because the memory of Jesus and the memory of his sermons will provide a base for forming a new faith and a base for forming of a new theology. And this faith, which originally starts as or within the Jewish tradition, in the following years after Jesus' death, will start to look less and less like Jewish and take on a new form, that of Christianity. And Jesus' followers, soon after his death, will arise, that will announce that the Jesus himself had risen to heaven, an act called resurrection, and they will start to claim that Jesus revealed himself to them on numerous occasions during the following weeks after his crucifixion. And Jesus's disciples, also known as the apostles, as well as the other followers, who they will kind of take this story of Jesus's resurrection as an actual proof that Jesus originally claimed that he is the Messiah, and now he indeed is, and we have this resurrection to prove that this was the truth. And this belief in Jesus's resurrection will become the basic theological premise for this new sect or this new cult of Judaism that later will become Christianity. So that is to say that following Jesus' death, Jesus' followers and disciples were actually not calling themselves Christian yet at this point, but rather understood themselves to be members of this branch of a Jewish religion. And so they will organize a new religion as a subset of Judaism. And this is really important to remember at this point. They will meet, these disciples and the followers of Jesus will meet daily to preach, to pray, and to also establish their new religious rituals. And they decided that in order to be accepted in this new Jewish cult or to be initiated into this new religion, you first must be baptized, which is a ritual. Baptism itself is of course a ritual of purification by your body being submerged into a body of water. And baptism was not original to those people who practiced this cult of following Jesus, but rather they will take it from an earlier or adapted from an earlier Jewish tradition of also baptism, of also being immersed into water for the purpose of purification as well. And after the execution of Jesus, this small band of disciples will dedicate themselves to kind of spreading his teachings first among the Jewish people in Judea, hoping to get some converts to this new religion, with the goal to also later travel throughout the entire Roman Empire and spread the gospel, spread the good news to the people who were still under Roman occupation, practicing different kinds of Roman religions as well as Judaism. And Christianity will eventually, there he is, Christianity itself will eventually spread beyond its origins as a Jewish sect after the works of one person in particular, the Paul of Tarsus, also later to be known as the Paul the Apostle. And Paul, historically, as a historical figure, was a well educated Jewish person who was comfortable both in the Roman as well as the Jewish worlds. And the New Testament reports to us that he prosecuted at first the members of this new Jewish sect, but then on the road to the city of Damascus in the Middle East, in Syria, he will be struck blind and he will hear Jesus' voice. And soon thereafter, he will gain his sight. He will convert to this sect of Judaism that claimed that Jesus is the Messiah. And he will also become a vigorous promoter of Jesus's ideas. And from the mid 30s to the mid 50s, he will establish several Christian communities, first in the territory known as the Asia Minor, which today is the country of Turkey, particularly first in the city of Tarsus. Hence, we have Paul of Tarsus, Tarsus being the city in Asia Minor / Turkey where he was from. And from there, he will start to spread around, travel around, trying to spread the news of this new faith and try to gain converts. And he was fairly efficient in gaining converts to this new faith because he spoke 3 different languages. He spoke the Hebrew, traditional Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. So as he traveled, he spoke to people about Jesus in their native language, which kind of caught people's attention and made people and made not only Paul but only this new religion kind of approachable and acceptable for all these different people across the Roman Empire. And he will convert many followers of Roman and Greek traditions, religions, and people from all social classes, all genders, which was very important in gaining converts to this new faith. And Paul will also suggest that the only way Christianity can grow, the only way actually this new religion can grow, is if it becomes a separate tradition, a separate religion, separate from the Jewish tradition itself. And so, for that reason, he is the key figure in changing Christianity, changing this or making this new branch of Judaism as its own separate religion, separate from Judaism, now also called as the Christian religion, right? So we no longer have Jesus's followers as a branch of Judaism, but now with Paul and under Paul, it's now called Christianity. And during his travels, he will write letters sharing what he thought were Jesus's ideas, and he will refine them into more specific teachings that will form the core of the New Testament. And it's important to note that Paul will be the author of the majority of the books of the New Testament. And the New Testament actually consists of 27 different books or texts, and out of these 27, 13 are traditionally attributed to Paul, meaning that Paul was very likely the author of 13 of these books. So it's interesting that, here we have a person who is a major figure in constructing this new religion that becomes Christianity. And the author of its core religious text, the New Testament, claimed that he is recording the words of Messiah himself, that he is recording the words of Jesus, even though he, Paul of Tarsus, himself did not know Jesus and only have heard of Jesus after the crucifixion. And he will, of course, write the New Testament following the Jesus's death. Um, I will stop here. It's a good place to stop. To hit you with the shorter lecture today, it's been intense for past few weeks, so this is a shorter lecture. Yay for you! And when we return back, we're going to be talking about what effects did this new religion have on the Roman Empire. And also, we will study how Christianity will be organized and what will be some of the actions of many of the Roman emperors who will be very unsatisfied with the fact that Christianity was making more followers and the actions they will do in trying to, prevent it from spreading. Okay. Until then, I hope you will have a great rest of your day. Stay safe, and I will see you again soon. Bye bye.